Um, Welcome everyone to Enver Society's book club. Today we will be starting reading our first book. Um, the book is called Black Bolshevik. It is a book which has been written by Harry Haywood in 1978, and it deals with his life and work as an Afro-American communist. Um, Harry Haywood, he was born in 1898 as a child to slaves, and has died on January 4th, 1985, at the age of 86. Um, he was an Afro-American Marxist-Leninist who has dedicated his life to the struggle for the working class, has addressed the theoretical issue of race in many of his works, and essentially, we will read his book, Black Bolshevik, to read about his life, his work, his struggle with issues of the working class and of black people in the United States, and also with his struggle in revisionism after the Khrushchevite takeover of the communist movement after 1956. So, essentially, we will be meeting every Monday at the same time and read a chapter or two every time and essentially uh, discuss it. I'll be glad if we would get done with this book in around 2 to 3 months. It's a relatively large book. I would ask you to please all go ahead and download it. You can go to the channel called Book Club Info. There you can go and download the PDF, open it, and look at the index to see how many pages the book has. Mine has roughly around 720, so it is a relatively chunky boy which we're dealing with. I This is not going to be about holding great lectures like the Academy of Marxism-Leninism is, the one we have been having with Ramon Pulpo last Saturday. No, this is just going to be something much more relaxed, some sort of a reading session of the book. And essentially, I'm waiting for volunteers. So hopefully, you all have the document opened. Just write me in the chat if you have. Do you all have the document opened? All right. So let's begin with the prologue of the acknowledgements. I will be the first one to read out a few pages. Then I'm going to ask a volunteer of you to continue on with the next few pages, and so on. I'm trying to make this interactive, get every one of you involved, and at the end we will talk about what we have learned, if we took any inspiration from the considered chapters, and so on. So, Black Bolshevik, autobiography of an Afro-American communist. Harry Haywood. To my family, Gwen Haywood, Junior, and Becky. Acknowledgements. There have been many friends and comrades who have, directly or indirectly, helped me with the writing of this book. Unfortunately, they are too numerous to all be named here. There are a number of young people who have helped with the editorial, research and typing tasks and helped the project along through political discussions. Special thanks to Ernie Allen, who gave yeoman help with the early chapters. Others whose assistance was indispensable include Jody and Susan Chandler, Paula Cohen, Stu Dowdy, and Janet Goldwasser, Paul Elitzig, Pat Fry, Gary Goff, Sherman Miller, John Schwartz, blah blah blah. Others who gave me assistance are Rennie Blacken and Nathalie Gasher. Over the past years, I have had discussions with several veteran comrades and friends who have helped immeasurably in jogging my memory and filling in the gaps where my own experience was lacking. I extend my warmest appreciation to Jesse Gray, Josh Lawrence, and so on. I hope you all agree that it is necessary to read out all of the names. And Jack and Ruth Schulman. A political autobiography is necessarily shaped by experiences over the years, and by comrades who helped and influenced me in the long battle for self-determination and against revisionism. My earliest political debts are to the first corps of black cadres in the CPUSA, Cyril Briggs, Edward Doty, Richard B. Moore, and to my brother Otto Hall, all former members of the African Blood Brotherhood. To Harrison George, outstanding son of the working class, charter members of the CPUSA, former editors of The Daily Worker and The People's World, who gave his all to the communist movement and died alone, victimized for his premature anti-revisionism. A special tribute to my comrades in the battles against revisionism within the CPUSA and after, L. Lennon, veteran director of the Waterfront section and member of the Central Committee of the CPUSA, Charles Lohman, executive secretary of the Brooklyn Party Organization, Isidore Began, executive secretary of the Bronx Party Organization, Ellen and Pearl Laws, and so on. And to my wife, Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, my closest collaborator from 1953 through 1964 in the writing of manuscripts, as well as in the political battles, who has since established her own reputation as historian and essayist. A tribute to Ed Strong, former communist, youth leader and director of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, whose premature death in the mid-50s cut short his uncompromising stand within the Central Committee for the right of self-determination for the Black nation. To the editors of Soul Book magazine, who published my writings in 1965 to 1966 and invited me to Oakland, California in the spring of 1966 during the formative stages of the Black Panther movement. To Vincent Harding, who provided me with funds to return to the US from Mexico in 1970 and gave me technical and material assistance to begin this autobiography. Thanks to John Henry Clark and Francisco and Elizabeth Cadillac de Mora for their enthusiasm and moral support. To Robert Warner, director of the Michigan Historical Collections, for his help and his sensitivity to the need to collect and preserve historically relevant materials from the Black movement in the United States. All right, so now we're going to read the prologue. Is there any volunteer who would like to read? Then please request speaking permissions now. All right, Enveri, you can go ahead and read the prologue.
2 pages, right? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, 2 pages.
Yeah, I'll say stop.
Okay, prologue. On July 28, 1919, I literally stepped into a battle that was to last the rest of my life. Exactly 3 months after mustering out of the army, I found myself in the midst of one of the bloodiest race riots in US history. It was certainly a most dramatic return to the realities of American democracy. It came to me then that I had been fighting the wrong war. The Germans weren't the enemy was right here at home. These ideas had been developing ever since I landed home in April, and a lot of other black veterans were having the same thoughts. I had the job as a waiter on the Michigan Central Railroad at the time. In July, I was working the Wolverine, the cracked Michigan Central train between Chicago and New York. We would serve lunch and dinner on the run out of Chicago to St. Thomas, Canada, where the dining car was cut off the train. The next morning our cars would be attached to the Chicago-bound train, and we would serve breakfast and lunch into Chicago. On July 27, the Wolverine left on a regular run to St. Thomas. Passing through Detroit, we heard news that a race riot had broken out in Chicago. The situation had been tense for some time. Several members of the crew, all of them black, had bought revolvers and ammunition the previous week when on a special to Battle Creek, Michigan. Thus, when we returned to Chicago at about 2 p.m. the next day, July 28, we were apprehensive about what awaited us. The whole dining car crew, 6 waiters and 4 cooks, got off at the 12th Street station in Chicago. Usually we would stay on the car while it backed out to the yards, but the station seemed a better route now. We were all tense as we passed through the station on the way to the elevated which would take us to Southside and home. Suddenly a white trainman accosted us. "Hey, you guys going out to the Southside?" "Yeah, so what?" I said, immediately on the alert, thinking he might start something. "If I were you, I wouldn't go by the avenue." He meant Michigan Avenue, which was right in front of the station. "Why?" "There's a big race riot going on out there, and already this morning a couple of colored soldiers were killed coming in unsuspectingly. If I were you, I'd keep off the street and go right out those tracks by the lake. We took the trainman's advice, thanked him, and turned toward the tracks. It would be much slower walking home, but if he were right, it would be safer. As we turned down the tracks toward the south side of the city towards the Black Ghetto, I thought of what I had just been through in Europe and what now lay before me in America. On one side of us lay the summer warmness of Lake Michigan. On the other was Chicago, a huge and still growing industrial center of the nation, bursting at its seams, brawling, sprawling Chicago. Hawk Butcher for the nation, as Carl Sandburg had called it. As we walked, I remembered the war. On returning from Europe, I had felt good to be alive. I was glad to be back with my family, mom, pop, and my sister. At 21, my life lay before me. What should I do? The only trade I had learned was waiting tables. I hadn't even finished the 8th grade. Perhaps I should go back to France, live there, and become a French citizen. After all, I hadn't seen any Jim Crow there. Had race prejudice in the US lessened? I knew better. Conditions in the States had not changed, but we blacks had. We were determined not to take it anymore. But what was I walking into?
All right. Thank you very much, Comrade Adonis.
Alright.
Um, I think 2 pages should be enough. So, all right. I'm not going to read that name out loud. I'm going to change your name back to Comrade David because I'm not going to say your current name. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No
Um,
problem. We're on page 3.
Southside Chicago, the Black Ghetto was like a besieged city. Whole sections of it were in ruins. Buildings burned, and there was a heavy with smoke, reminiscent of the Holocaust from which I had recently returned. Our small band huddled like a bunch of raw recruits under machine gun fire, turned up 26th Street and then into heart of the ghetto at 35th in and Indiana. We split up and go our various way. I headed for home at 42nd Place and Bowen. None of us returned to work until the riot was over. More than a week later, the battle at home was just as real as the battle in France had been. As I recall, there was a full-scale street fighting between black and white. Blacks were snatched from the from street cars and beaten or killed. Pitched battles were fought in the ghetto streets. Hoodlums roamed in the neighborhoods, shooting at random blacks, fought back. As I saw at the time, Chicago was two cities. The one was Chamber of Commerce City of the American Miracle, the Chicago of 1893 World Columbian Exposition. It was the new industrial city which had grown in 50 years from the frontier town to become a second largest city in the country. The black community, had been part of Chicago almost from the time the city was founded. Jean-Baptiste Berton de Sablé, a black trapper from French Canada, was the first settler. Later came fugitive slaves, and after the Civil War, more blacks fleeing from post-Reconstruction terror, taking jobs as a domestic and personal servants. The large increase was in the late 1880s through the World War One. As the industry in the city expanded and as blacks streamed north following the promised jobs, housing, and end to Jim Crow lynching, the Illinois Central Track ran straight to the deep south from Chicago to the New Orleans and the Panama limit made the run every day. Those that took the train north didn't find the promised land. They found job and housing all right, but they had to compete with the thousands of recent immigrants from the Europe who were also drawn to the job in the packing house, stockyard and steel mills. Uh, the promise of end of the Jim Crow were never to fulfill. In these days, the beaches on the Lake Michigan were segregated. Most were reserved for white only. The 26th Street beach close to the black community was open to blacks, but only as long as they uh, stay on their own side. The riot had started at this beach, which was then jammed with a late July crowd. Eugene Williams, as a 17-year-old black youth, was killed while swimming off the right side of the beach. The black community was immediately alive with accounts of what happened. That he had been murdered while swimming, that Grant White had thrown rocks at him and killed him, and that the police on duty at the beach had refused to make any arrest. This incident was the spark that ignited the flames of racial animosity which had been smoldering for months. Fi- Fighting between blacks and whites broke out on 26th Street beach after the Williams death. It soon spread beyond the beaches and lasted over 6 days before it was over. The 38 people, black and white, were dead. 57, 507, 37 injured, and over 1,000 homeless. The memory of this mass rebellion is still very sharp in my mind. It was the great turning point in my life, and I have dedicated myself to the struggle against capitalism ever since. In the following pages of my autobiography, I have attended to trace the development of struggle in the hopes that today's youth can learn from the both successes and failures. It, it is for the youth and the bright future of socialist USA that this book has been written.
All right, thank you very much, Comrade David. So, as we've just read the prologue and technically have finished the chapter, I would like to ask you first, who would like to say something about the chapter? Is there anything particular about the prologue? Was there anything inspiring or something shocking and surprising? Um, all right, Exotrios, welcome to the podium.
Thank you. I thought it was surprising that the train conductor told the quote-unquote black people to get off the train at another place so they would be safe. I don't think many people would have done the same.
Yeah, and if you're curious on what surprised me in the prologue, it's the murder of Eugene Williams. I mean, we constantly see those murders of black people in the United States, and it's surprising that since the 70s, nothing has essentially changed. All right, so yeah, that's it. Would you like to continue reading with chapter
Yeah,
1?
sure.
All right, thank you.
Chapter 1: A Child of Slaves. I was born in South Oklahoma, Nebraska on February 4th, 1889. The youngest of the three children of Harriet and Haywood Hall, Otto, my older brother, was born in May 1891, and Appa, my sister, in December 1869. The 1890s had been a decade of far-reaching structural change in the economic and political life of the United States. These were fateful years in which the pattern of the 20th century subjugation of blacks was set. A young U.S. imperialism was ready in the 1898 to shoulder its share of the white man's burden and take its manifest destiny beyond the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico. In the war against Spain, it embarked on its first civilizing mission against the colored people of the Philippines and the mixed breeds of Cuba and Puerto Rico. In the course of the decade and a half following the Spanish-American War, the two-faced banner of racism and imperialist benevolence was carried to the majority of the Caribbean countries and the whole of Latin America. The echo of this industrial imperialism in America, said W. E. B. Du Bois, was the expulsion of black men from American democracy, their subjection to caste control and wage slavery. In 1877, the Hayes-Tilden Agreement had successfully aborted the ongoing democratic revolution of the Reconstruction in the South. Blacks were sold down the river as the northern capitalists, with the assistance of some former slaveholders, gained full economic and political control in the South. Henceforward, it was assured that the future development of the region would be carried out in complete harmony with the interests of Wall Street. The following years saw the defeat of the southern-based agrarian populist movement, with its promise of black and white unity against the power of monopoly capital. The counter-revolution against Reconstruction was in full swing. Beginning in 1890, the southern state legislatures enacted a series of disenfranchisement laws within the next 16 years. These laws were destined to completely abrogate the right of blacks to vote. The same period saw the revival of the notorious Black Codes, the resurgence of the hooded terror of the Ku Klux Klan, and the defeat of the re-election in 1905 of the last black congressman surviving the Reconstruction period. Jim Crow laws enforcing segregation in the public facilities were enacted by southern states and municipal governments. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld Jim Crow in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1869, declaring that the legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts and establishing the principle of separate but equal. This decision.
It was not 1869 but 1896. But don't worry, continue.
This decision was only reversed in 1945. 54.
51, no problem.
Yeah, it's different in my language.
In German, it's too, trust me.
Yeah.
We get confused all the time.
When the U.S. Supreme Court held that separate facilities were inherently unequal. At the time when I was born, the black experience was mainly a southern one. The overwhelmingly majority of the black people still resided in the South. Most of the black inhabitants of the South, Ohama, were refugees from the 20-year terror of the post-Reconstruction period. Ohama itself, despite its Midwestern location, did not escape the terror completely, as indicated by the lying of a black man, Joe Coe, by a mob
actually, sorry, that's actually a C. Not an
Oh,
EH.
yeah.
It's just printed that way. That's I was confused too. It's not henceforward, but henceforward, and it's
Yeah, I also
lynching.
thought, yeah, lynching of a black man. Joe Coe by a mob in 1891. Many people had relatives and families in the South. Some had trekked up to Kansas in 1879, 79, yeah, under the leadership of Henry Adams of Louisiana and Moses Pap Singleton of Tennessee. and many had then continued further north to Omaha and Chicago. My parents were born slaves in 1860. They were 3 years old at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. My father was born on a plantation in Martin County, Tennessee, north of Memphis. The plantation was owned by Colonel Haywood Hall, who my father remembered as a kind and benevolent man.
All right, so thank you very much, Exatrius, for reading 2 pages. Now let's see who would like to continue. Mike Star 174.
Hi.
Hello, comrade. Welcome.
Okay. When the slaves were emancipated in 1863, my grandfather, with the consent of Mr. Hall, took both the given name and surname of his former master. I never knew Grandfather Hall, as he died before I was born. According to my father and Unless, he was, as they said in those days, much of a man. He was active in local reconstruction politics and probably belonged to the Black militia. Although Tennessee did not have a Reconstruction government, there were many whites who supported the democracy aims that were pursued during the Reconstruction period. But Tennessee was also the home of the Ku Klux Klan, where it was first organized after the Civil War. In the terror that followed the High-Tilden Agreement, these night riders had marked my grandfather out as a bad nigger for lynching. At first, they were deterred because of the paternalism of Colonel O. Many of O's former slaves still lived on his plantation after the war ended, and the colonel had let it be known that he would kill the first son of a bitch that trespassed on his property and tried to terrorize his niggers. But the anger of the night riders, strengthened by orange liquor, finally overcame their fear of Colonel O. My father, who was about 15 at the time, described what happened. One night, the clansmen rode onto the plantation and headed straight for grandfather's cabin. They broke open the door and one poked his head into the darkened cabin. "Hey, old nigger, where are you?" My grandfather was standing inside and fired his shotgun point blank at the holder head. The clansman, Elvis had blown off, toppled onto the floor of the cabin, and his companions mounted their horses and fled. Grandmother, then pregnant, fell against the iron bed. Grandfather got the family out of the cabin and they ran into a big house for protection. It was obvious they couldn't stay in Tennessee, so the colonel hitched up a wagon and personally drove them to safety, outside of Martin County. Some of grandfather's family were already living in Des Moines, Iowa, so the whole family left by train for Des Moines the following morning. The shock of this experience was so great that grandmother gave birth prematurely to their third child, my Uncle George, who lived to be 95. Grandmother, however, became a chronic invalid and died a few years after the flight from Tennessee. From Tennessee. Father was only in his teens when the family left for Des Moines, so he spent most of his youth there. In the late 1880s, he left and moved to South Omaha, where there was more of a chance to get work. He got a job at Cudahy's Packing Company, where he worked for more than 20 years. First as a beef lugger, loading sides of beef on refrigerated freight cars, and then a janitor in the main office building. Not long after his arrival, he met and married Mother Harry Thorpe, who had come up from Kansas City, Missouri, at about the same time. Father was powerfully I'm sorry. Father was powerfully built, of medium height, with tremendous breadth. He had 46-inch chest and weighed over 200 pounds. He was an extremely intelligent man, with little or no formal schooling. He had taught himself to read and write and was a prodigious reader. Unfortunately, despite his great strength, he was not much of a fighter, or so it seemed to me. In later years, some of the old slaves' psychology and fear remained. He was an ardent admirer of Booker T. Washington, who in his Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895 had called on blacks to submit to the racist status quo. Uncle George was the opposite. He would brook no insult and had been known to clean out a whole bedroom when offended. The middle brother, Watt, was also a fighter, and was especially dangerous if he had a knife or had been drinking. I remember both of them complaining of my father's timidity. My mother's family also had great fighting spirit. Her father, Jerry Thorpe, was born on a plantation near Bowling Green, Kentucky. He was illiterate, but very smart and very strong. Even as an old man, his appearance made us believe stories that were told of his strength as a young man. When he was feeling fine and happy, his exuberance would get the best of him, and he'd grab the largest man around, hoist him on his shoulders, and run around the yard with him. Grandfather Thorpe was half Creek Indian and had an Indian profile with a humped nose and high cheekbones. His hair was short and curly, and he had a light brown complexion. He had a straggly white beard that he tried to cultivate into Van Dyke. He said his father was a Creek Indian and his mother a black plantation slave. No one knew his exact age, but we made a guess based on the story he often told us. It was about
Alright,
6. Yeah.
Sorry, that were 2 pages.
What? Okay,
Those
okay,
were
I'm
2
sorry.
pages already.
Okay, okay,
No
okay.
problem.
I'm sorry, I
Thank
didn't
you
know
very
it.
much. Would anyone else like to continue? Thanks a lot, by the way, for your contribution. I'd prefer someone who hasn't read out yet. Alright, so, undercover CIA agent. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you just fine. We are
All
on
right.
page 9.
All right. I'll start the sentence from the previous page. So, Grandfather Trope was half Greek Indian, half an Indian profile with a humped nose and high cheekbones. His hair was short and curly, and he had a light brown complexion. He had a straggly white beard that he tried to cultivate into a Van Dyke. He said his father was a Creek Indian and his mother a black plantation slave. No one knew his exact age, but we made a guess based on a story he often told us. He was about 6 or 7 years old when he said the stars fell. When was that, Grandpa? Oh, one night the stars fell. I remember it very clearly. The skies were all lit up by falling stars. People were scared almost out of their wits. The old master and mistress and all the slaves were running out on the road, falling down on their knees to pray and ask forgiveness. We thought the judgment day had surely come. Glory, hallelujah, it was the last fire. The next day the ground was all covered with ashes. At first we thought all of that was just his imagination, something he had fantasized as a child and then remembered as a real event. But then my old brother Otto was in high school. He got interested in astronomy and came across a reference to a meteor shower of 1833. We figured out that was what Grandfather Trope had been talking about. So he concluded that he was born around 1825 or 1826. Grandfather Trope was filled with stories, many about slavery. Children, I've got scars I'll carry to my grave. He would show us the welts on his back from slave beatings. My grandmother also had them. Most of his beatings came from his first master in Kentucky, but he was later sold to a man in Missouri, whom he said treated him much better. This may have been due in part to his value as a slave. He was skilled both as a carpenter and cabinet maker. Grandfather had many stories to tell about the Civil War. He was in Missouri at the time, living in an area that was first taken by a group known as Quartel's Raiders, a guerrilla-like band of irregulars who fought for the South. and then by the Union forces. When the Union soldiers first came into the plantations, they would call in slaves from the fields and make them sit in the great drawing room of the house. They would then force the master and mistress and their family to cook and serve for the slaves. Grandfather told us that the soldiers would never eat any of the food that was served because they were afraid of getting poisoned. The master on the plantation was generally decent when it became clear that Union forces were going to control the area for a while. At the time, grandfather and my grandmother Anne lived on an adjacent plantation somewhere near Moberly, Missouri. Grandfather was allowed to visit Anne on weekends, often on Sundays, and when he went to make a visit, he was challenged by Union guards. They would roughly demand to know his mission. My grandfather and grandmother got married with the agreement of their two masters and eventually had a family of 5 daughters and 2 sons. Grandfather Trope was given a plot of land in return for his services as a carpenter, but the family soon moved into Moberly. As the children reached working age, the family began to break up, but the girls always remained very close. They came back to visit frequently and never broke family ties as the boys had. My mother, Harriet, was born when grandmother was a slave on the plantation of Squires Quincy in Howard County, Missouri. After the family moved into Moberly, mother worked for a while for a white family in the town. She later went to St. Joseph, Missouri to work for another white family. One day, while she was at work in St. Joseph, she heard a shot and then screams from down the street. She ran out to see what had happened. There was a great commotion and the crowd of people was gathering in front of the house next door. The family living there went by the name of Howard, a man, wife, and 2 children. Both the man and his wife were church members. They appeared to be a most respectable couple. Miss Howard had been very active in church affairs and socials. Her husband was frequently absent because, she said, he was a traveling salesman and his work took him out of town for long periods of time. What the neighbors were not aware of was that Mr. Howard was none other than the legendary Jesse James. He was shot in the back while hanging a picture in his house. The man who killed him was Robert Ford, a member of Jesse's own gang who had turned traitor for a bribe offered by the Burns Detective Agency.
Comrade, there were 2 pages. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
All right, so who would like to continue? Anyone? Feel free to raise your hands. Don't be shy. We want everyone's voice to be heard. I mean, as long as they want, of course. All right.
Hello?
Yeah, hello, we can hear you. Thanks a lot for your contribution.
Right. I'll start from the sentence on page 10. What the neighbors were not aware of was that Mr. Howard was none other than the legendary Jesse James. He was shot in the back while hanging a picture in his house. The man who killed him was Robert Ford, a member of Jesse's own gang who had turned traitor for a bribe offered by the Burns Detective Agency. When my mother did the laundry, I remember she would often sing the Ballad of Jesse James, a song which became popular after his death. Jesse James was a man, he killed many a man. The man that robbed, that demmed the train, it was a dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard, and they laid Jesse James in his grave. Oh, the people held their breath when they heard of Jesse's death, and they wondered how he came to die. He was shot on the sly by little Robert Ford, and they laid poor Jesse in his grave. In 1893, my mother went to Chicago to visit her sister and see the exposition. She said she saw Frank James, Jesse's brother. He was out of prison then, a very dignified old man with a long white beard. He had been hired to ride around as an attraction at one of the exhibitions. Mother kept moving up to the north by stages. After the job in St. Joseph's, she found work in St. Louis. She arrived to find the city in a tense situation. The whole town was on the verge of a race riot. The immediate cause was the murder of an Irish cop named Brady. The black community was elated, for Brady was a quote-unquote nigger-hating cop who carved notches on his pistol to show the number of blacks he had killed. Brady finally met his end at the hands of bad black man who ran a gambling house in Brady's district. The gambling, of course, was illegal, but as often was the case, the cops were paid off with a cut from the takings of the house. As the story was told to me, Brady and the gambler met on the street one day and got into an argument. Brady accused the gambler of not giving him his proper cut. This was denied vehemently. Brady then threatened to close the place down. The black man told him, "Don't you come into my place when the game's going on." He then turned and walked off. The scene was witnessed by several blacks, and the news of how the gambler defied Brady spread immediately throughout the black district. This was bad stuff for Brady. It might lead to, quote-unquote, niggers getting notions, end quote, as the cops put it. A few days passed and Brady made his move. He went to the gambling house when the game was on and was shot dead. Some anonymous black bard wrote a song about it all. "Brady, why didn't you run? You know you'd done wrong. You came in the room when the game was going on." Brady went below looking for a mighty curious. Devil said, "Where you from?" "I'm from East St. Louis. East St. Louis, come this way. I've been expecting you every day." The song was immediately popular in the black community and became a symbol of rebellious feelings. Mother said that when she arrived at St. Louis, blacks were singing this song all over town. The police realized the danger in such notions and began to arrest anyone they caught singing it. 40 years later, I was pleasantly surprised to hear Carl Sandburg singing the same song as part of his repertoire of folk ballads in the Midwest. I had not heard it since Mother had sung it to us. Mother later moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and then to South Omaha. Her marriage there to my father was her second. As a very young girl in Moberly, she had married John Harvey, but he was, to use her words, a no-good yellow nigger who expected me to support him. They had one child, Gertrude, before he deserted her. Gertie came to Omaha sometime after my mother and married my father's youngest brother, George. I have a feeling that Mother promoted this match. The two hard-working, sober-hall brothers must have been quite a catch.
Thanks a lot, Rabbit. Those were 2 pages. Who would like to continue? Preferably someone who hasn't read out yet. You can keep your hand raised, undercover CIA agent. I'm just asking the rest of the group. Is there anyone? All right. Thanks a lot for raising your hand anyways, undercover CIA agent. I appreciate it. Yeah, Midgard. Thank you.
Quick question. What page are we on again?
Hold on a second. We are at page 12.
Page 12. Okay, let me just scroll down a bit. All right.
We just finished page 12 and now we are on page 13, sorry.
Okay. As I remember Mother in my childhood years, she was a small brown-skinned woman, rather on the plumpish side, with large and beautiful soft brown eyes. She had the humped Indian nose of the Thorpe family. My first memory of her is hearing her sing as she did housework. She had a melodious contralto voice, and what seemed to me to be an endless and varied repertoire. Much of what I know about this period I learned from her songs. These included lullabies, such as "Go to Sleep, You Little Pickaninny, Mama's Gonna Swat You If You Don't," and many spirituals and jubilee songs. There were also innumerable folk ballads, and the popular songs of her day like "Down at the Ball" and "Where Did You Get That Hat?" Then there was the old song of the slaves sang about their masters fleeing the Union Army, the year of the Jubilo. "Oh, darkies, have you seen the massa, I think? The massa with the mustache on his face. He was going down the road this morning like he's going to leave this place. Oh, the massa run, ha ha, and the darkies sing ho ho, It must be now the kingdom comin' and the year of jubilo. Mother never went to school a day in her life, but she had a phenomenal memory and was taught a virtual repository of black folklore. My brother Otto taught her to read and write when she was 40 years old. She told stories of life on the plantations, of the hollers they used. When a slave wanted to talk to a friend on a neighboring plantation, she would throw back her head, I can't tell what that says, and have a...
And half sing, half yell.
And half sing, half yell, "Oh, Bessie, I want to see you." Often you could hear one of the hollers a mile away. When Mother was a girl, camp meetings were a big part of her life. She had songs she remembered from the meetings, like "I Don't Feel Weary, No Ways Tired," and she would imitate her preachers with all of their promises of fire and brimstone. Later, when we lived in South Omaha, she was very active in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As a means of raising funds, she used to organize church theatricals. Otto would help her read the plays. She would then direct them and usually play their leading role herself. She was a natural mimic. I heard her go through entire plays from beginning to end, imitating the voices, even the male ones, and the actions of the performers. In addition to caring for Otto, Eppa, and myself, Mother got jobs catering parties for rich white families in North Omaha. She would bring us back all sorts of goodies and leftovers from these parties. Sometimes she would get together with her friends among her other domestics, and they would have a great time panning their employers and exchanging news of the white folks' scandalous doings. Mother had the great fighting spirit of her family. She was a strong-minded woman with great ambition for her children, especially for us boys. Eppa, who was a plain black girl, was sensitive but physically tough, courageous, and a regular tomboy. Worried about her future, Mother insisted that she learn the piano and arranged for her to take lessons at 25 cents each. Though she learned to play minor classics such as Poet and Peasant, arias from such operas as Aida and Il Trovatore accompanied the choir and so on, Eppa never liked music very much and was not consoled by it the way Mother was. As a wife, Mother had a way of making Father feel the part of the man of the house. She flattered his ego and always addressed him as Mr. Hall in front of guests and us children. Then there's a little thing, life in South Omaha. You ask what town I love the best. South Omaha, South Omaha. The fairest town of all the rest. South Omaha, South Omaha. Where yonder's Papillon, limp stream, to where Missouri's waters gleam. O fairest town, O town of mine, South Omaha, South Omaha.
Thank you. Thanks 1,000 times for reading this out. I have a question. Do you read out audiobooks on a professional basis or something?
No.
You sound like a professional.
Oh, thank you.
I've really enjoyed listening to you, sorry.
My mom used to read to me all the time, and I still like to read aloud to myself and my other friends, so I just have some practice. I also am an actor, so I'm good at reading lines.
You're an actor. That's
Yeah.
great. Sorry, let's talk a bit about after the book club. So, who else would like to read out something? And thanks a lot for your contribution. Thanks. All right, so who's next? All right, undercover CIA agent. You've waited one turn, now it's your turn again.
All right. In the early part of the century, the last days of my youth, South Omaha was an independent city. In 1915, it was annexed to become part of the larger city of Omaha. Like many Midwestern towns, the city took its name from the original inhabitants of the area. In this case, it was the Omaha Indians of the Sioux tribal family. The area was the camping ground of the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804. It grew in importance when it became a Lance's training post and an important outfitting point during the Colorado Gold Rush. but the main growth to South Omaha came in the 1880s as the meatpacking industry developed. In 1877, the first refrigerated railroad cars were perfected. This made it possible to slaughter livestock in the Midwest and ship the meat to the large markets in eastern cities. As a result, the meatpacking industry grew tremendously in the Midwest. The city leaders saw the opportunity and encouraged the expanding packing industry to settle there, offering them special tax concessions and so forth. The town, situated on the plateau back from the Big Muddy, the Missouri River, began to grow. Soon it was almost an industrial suburb of Omaha and was one of the 3 largest packing centers in the country. All of the big packers of the time, Armour, Swift, Wilson, and Cudley, had big branches there. Cudley's main plant was in South Omaha. The industry brought with it growing railroad traffic. As a boy, I watched dozens of lines of cars as they carried livestock in from the west and butchered meat to ship out to the east. The Burlington, the Chicago, and Northwestern, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, the Illinois Central, the Rock Island, the Union Pacific. All of these lines had terminals there. By 1910, Omaha was the 4th largest railway center in the country. When I was born in 1898, South Omaha was a bustling town of about 20,000. Some of these 20,000 people were foreign-born and first-generation immigrants. The 2 largest groups were Irish and Bohemians, or Czechs. There was a sprinkling of other Slavic groups, Poles, Russians, Serbs, as well as Germans, Greeks, and Italians. The Bohemians were the largest ethnic group in town. They lived mainly in the southern part of town towards the river, in the Brown Park and Albright sections. One thing that impressed me was their concern with education. They were a cultural group of people. I can't remember any of them being illiterate, and they had their own newspaper. They were involved in the political wheelings and dealings of the town and were successful. At one time, both the major and chief of police were Bohemians. The Irish were the 2nd largest group, scattered throughout the town. The newly arrived poor shanty Irish were first settled on Indian Hill, near the stockyards. There were 2 classes of Irish, the shanty Irish on the one hand, and the old settlers, or lace-curtain Irish, on the other. The second group, who had settled only 1 generation before, was mostly made up of middle-class white settlers and professional workers who lived near South Omaha. There were also a few Irish who were very rich, managers and executives who lived in Omaha proper.
Could you jump back a sentence? Your connection just cut off. Or was it just me?
All right.
Sorry, it would be good if you could jump back a sentence. I apologize.
Oh. There were also people who were very managers who lived in Omaha. They had assimilated in community.
Sorry,
it
starts again.
For the poor,
Sorry, your connection just cut off entirely. We couldn't understand a single word. Could you say something? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, now we can hear you again. Sorry. Could you please jump back and read a sentence all over again? Sorry, your connection just cut off again. Hello, are you still there? All right, so it seems like we have some technical issues here. Would somebody else like to continue? Anyone? All right, Cormac, David?
Yeah, hello. I will start where he cut off.
Thank you.
Settled on the generation before was mostly made up of the middle class, white collar, civil service, and professional workers who lived near or north of Omaha. There was also a few Irish who were pretty rich managers and executives who lived in Omaha proper. They had become well assimilated into community. The tendency was the poor Irish to live in South Omaha, and those who had made it into degree or another would move up to the North Omaha or Omaha proper. There was only a few dozen black families in South Omaha scattered through the community. There was no Black Ghetto, as I saw it, no N-word problem. It was due undoubtedly to the our small numbers. True, there was a relatively large numbers of blacks living in North Omaha. The black community there had grown after the blacks were brought as a strikebreakers during the 1994 strike in the packing industry. I'm sorry, but no real ghetto developed until after World War One. Our family lived the heart of the Bohemian neighborhood in South Omaha. Nearly all of our neighbors were Bohemians. They came from many backgrounds. There were workers and peasant professionals, artists, musicians, and other skilled artisans, all fleeing from the oppressive rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were friendly people and kept to their language and traditions. On Saturdays, families would gather on the bear gardens and sang and dance. I remember watching them dance Scottishes and folkless. Listen to the beautiful music of their bands and orchestras, or running after their great marching bands. When I'm sorry, I'm sorry. When remember watching them Scottish and folks listening to the beautiful music of their bands and orchestras or running after their great marching band. When they were in parade on special occasions, they would bring out their colorful costumes. Much of their community life centered around gymnastic clubs, circles, or turners' halls, which they had established.
David?
Yeah, they were different.
David?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. You were just supposed to take over for undercover CIA agent,
Oh,
and
sorry.
those were his 2 pages. Thanks a
Oh,
lot.
sorry. Sorry.
No, no problem. It's all right. Thanks a lot for taking off and even remembering the passage. You've done a great contribution. So, who would like to pick off and continue from page 17? All right. We can't hear you, Mike Star. Hello? All right, it seems like there's some technical issues. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Can I?
All right, continue.
Okay. On special occasions, they would bring out their colorful costumes. Much of their community life centered around the gymnastic clubs, circles, or turners' halls, which they had established. There were differences in how the ethnic groups related to each other and to the blacks in town. In those days, Indian Hill was the entombing. Sorry, my page is kind of, the font is just a bit weird here. Can't read it. In those days, Indian Hill was the stomping ground of teenage Irish toughs.
Stomping ground.
Stomping ground, yeah. Something's wrong with my page here. Anyways, one day a mob of predominantly Irish youths ran the small Greek colony out of town when one of their members allegedly killed an Irish cop. I remember seeing the Greek community leaving town one Sunday afternoon. There were men, women, and children, about 100 in all, walking down the railroad tracks carrying everything they could hold. Some of their houses had been burned, and a few of them had been beaten up in town. We should have seen the danger for us in this, but one black man even boasted to my father about how he had helped run the Greeks out. My father called him a fool. What business did you have helping that bunch of whites? Next time it might be you they run out. The incident was an ominous sign of tensions that were to come many years later. At the time, however, our family got along well with all the immigrant families in our immediate neighborhood. I loved the sweet haunting melodies of the Irish folk ballads, Rose of Tralee, Mother Macri, and many of the popular songs like My Irish Molio and Ogra Gavan. I Want to Go Back to Oregon. There was a bohemian couple living next door. On occasion, Mr. Rihau would get a bit too much under his belt. He'd come home and raise hell. When this happened, Mrs. Rihau scurried to Officer Bingham, the black cop, to get some help. I remember one afternoon when Bingham came to lend a hand in taming him. The bohemian was a little guy compared to him. Officer Bingham threw him down out in the yard and plunked himself down on Rihau's back. Dust flew as he kicked and thrashed and tried to get out from under the black man. Bingham just rode the storm, and when Rihau raised his head, he'd smack him around until the rebellion subsided.
All right. Thanks a lot, Adonis. This was page 17. I will make an announcement about this. It's 9 p.m. UTC now. And this was it in terms of the reading for today. If there's any comments or remarks which you would like to give about the book, some impressions, or something about the book club as a whole, then I'd really appreciate it if you could raise your hand and say something about it. So thanks a lot for having had participated today, and thanks a lot for all of your participation. All right, so let's hear some voices on today's circle. CIA agent?
I'm gonna be brief due to my connection troubles. I find it interesting he described his family history and living conditions in such great detail. It is quite surprising he can recall it all. What I find interesting is that he described the racism to be ever present in the entire American state, reaching from the Midwest, Chicago, to the South, despite there being abolitionist sentiments in the North during the Civil War. And the constant persecution and ethnic tension that was existing even in the small towns that dotted America, such as South Omaha. That's it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, undercover CIA agent. I agree, it is very detailed. I think that one thing that in particular stands out to me is the way in which Harry Haywood writes. So I think he has a very direct style. He's not afraid to use the N-word. He's not afraid to go into detail, like when his grandparents shot the Ku Klux Klan members with a shotgun, which I think was pretty based. I'm glad if racists die. They're pieces of shit anyway, so who cares if they're dead? So either way, I also think that he writes greatly in a lyrical way. He I think there were like 4 to 5 poems or something, and his interconnection between the personal lives of people and well, poetry and music is very outstanding. I think that Harry Haywood has written a great biography, Black Bolshevik, and considering that he's just talking about his about his grandparents and parents and their lives on the slavery plantation, I think that this is going to be a great read. Thanks a lot. You're a wonderful group, and I have heard some great contributions today. You've all have shown some interest in participation, and I'm looking forward to the coming book club circles. We'll see each other next week on Monday, and I'm thoroughly glad now you just have some time until you can say something. Yeah, of course, Mikester. You can share your thoughts on this as well. All right, so seems like he did want to share his thoughts with us after all. So, yeah, you're all my noble comrades: Dead Prank, Exotrios, June Bach, Midgard Stormer, Rabbit, Real G, Red Emma, Svetlana, Undercover CIA Agent, Abdullah, Envery, Ruby Belband, El Faku, Maximizer. Thanks a lot, everyone, for participation. Also, thanks a lot to Mike Star. Thanks a lot for everyone who has read out. Thanks a lot to Corporate Ramon for participation. Thanks a lot to Spielmeister. Thanks a lot to everyone who has cut out in the middle. And you're all dismissed. We can meet in the voice chat and talk about today's study circle. And I wish you all a wonderful week. See you next Monday. Goodbye.